you very much. I'm sorry to have to call for quiet. It's lovely to see so many people have turned out for this important event. I'm Bernard Fishman, the director of the Maine State Museum, and on behalf of the museum and the Maine State Legislature, I'm grateful to be able to welcome you to this ceremony to present the official portrait of Senator George Mitchell for inclusion in the State House Portrait Collection and public display in the Hall of Flags. I also invite you at the conclusion of this event to join us in a reception upstairs in the rotunda on the 3rd floor. Senator Mitchell, your family, friends, distinguished political leaders and officials and members of the public, thank you very much for joining us today. The man we honor here falls into that very narrow category of figures that needs no introduction. And indeed, I'm not going to provide one. That'll be offered shortly by Maine State historian Earl J. Shuttleworth, who will also give you a brief and stimulating history of the State House Portrait Collection. What I would like to do briefly is to remind us of one of the essential elements an exercise like this is intended to accomplish. That is, to inspire us through the power of memory and the example of the person being honored, and encourage us to emulate the admirable achievements and exemplary character that is presented before us today. A few of you in the audience know that my career began as an Egyptologist, and we all know that nobody does historical memory better than the ancient Egyptians did. The Egyptians invented public art and public memory, and probably writing itself, in order to record names and events to make the indifferent and the relentless stream of time momentarily stand still to honor and recall human lives and accomplishments. This custom was refined by the Greeks and the Romans, who were avid to hold before them the evergreen examples of people whose lives might inform and improve their own. And they did this primarily through public art as well as written history. We here have inherited that long and great tradition. It's true that nowadays our own historical memory pays special attention to the great surge movements of the past and to the narratives of more ordinary lives, but as much as we rush to praise the common people, we still know the exceptional when we see it, and we continue to honor it. In seeking to recognize Senator Mitchell through a traditional form of public representation, the painted portrait, an art also probably invented by the ancient Egyptians, we are saying several fundamental things. We want him to know how highly we value him, and that this recognition is of an exceptional kind that can only be granted by a free citizenry conscious of the concepts of honor and gratitude. And we understand it is not only a gift to the senator, but also a gift to ourselves and to our future. We want him, through this image, to overpower the inevitable wastage of time and be with us always, to guide and encourage us. We want our descendants and posterity to know that the senator's portrait is here not as some automatic gesture, but as a perpetual recollection of civic virtue, reminding us of the best parts of our public natures and our duty to recognize the qualities that brought the man and the portrait to this place at the center of our public life, and to try to reflect these qualities in ourselves. Thank you, Senator, for what you've done for our state and our nation, and for what you will continue to do for all of us as an exemplar and as an inspiration. And now I would like to introduce Earl J. Shuttleworth, the Maine State historian, who more than any other living citizen of our state keeps alive the facts and significance of our grand history and of the people who have contributed to it. Thank you.
Senator Mitchell, Governor Brennan, Chief Justice Softly, other honored guests and friends. The idea of honoring noted Maine historical figures, historical and political, by displaying their portraits in the State House began on the eve of the Civil War, about 150 years ago, perhaps as a reflection of the patriotic spirit of the times. While serving in the Maine House of Representatives in 1860, a young James G. Blaine arranged to borrow portraits of our first governor, William King, and other famous Mainers to be on the walls of the State House. This led in the 1860s to the state acquiring portraits of Sir William Pepperell, General Henry Knox, and other personages from Maine's colonial past. Thus began the State House Portrait Collection, which today numbers 141 paintings of Maine governors, senators, congressmen, judges, and other notable figures. When Charles Bulfinch designed the Maine State House in 1828, he created this large space that we are now in, a public space on the first floor which he called the Open Hall. As the Civil War ended, Maine's regimental battle flags were returned to the State House for display in the Open Hall, which was then renamed the Hall of Flags, which we know it to this day. In addition to these banners, the Hall of Flags was reserved for the portraits of the state's most prominent leaders. Today, George J. Mitchell's portrait enters the Hall of Flags in recognition of the esteem in which he is held by his fellow citizens of Maine. His distinguished service as a federal judge and as Majority Leader of the Senate, his consummate skills as a mediator and diplomat on the national and international stages are accomplishments in which we all take pride, whether they are in the baseball field, in Northern Ireland, or in the Middle East. Senator Mitchell's portraits joins those of William King, James G. Blaine, Thomas B. Reed, Margaret J. Smith, and Edmund Muskie. Who were these 5 other Maine and women so honored? William King, a major advocate for separating Maine from Massachusetts, a drafter of the Maine Constitution who consulted with Thomas Jefferson for guidance in its preparation, and Maine's first governor. James G. Blaine, Speaker of the Maine House of Representatives, Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, Member of the U.S. Senate, Republican candidate for President in 1884, U.S. Secretary of State under 3 presidents who pioneered American foreign policy in Central and Southern America. And finally, one of the most well-known national political figures of the post-Civil War era, called the Plume Knight by his supporters and the Continental Liar from the state of Maine by his opponents. Thomas B. Reed, member of the Maine House and Senate, State Attorney General, Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, considered one of the most influential speakers in congressional history for his procedural reforms, known as Reed's Rules, many of which are still in force, for which he gained the title Czar Reed. A man of brilliant intellect and keen wit who was known for his memorable political comments. For example, when Speaker Reed heard a House member complaining that the national budget had surpassed $1 billion for the first time, he responded, "Yes, but sir, this is $1 billion country." Another House member quoted Henry Clay's famous remark that he would rather be right than president, to which Reed shot back the assurance that, quote, "The gentleman need not worry, he will never be either." When Reed was asked about his chances at receiving the 1896 presidential nomination, he remarked, "They can do worse than me, and they probably will." Finally, he was a kind of a practical prankster. He was summering at the Poland Spring Resort in the 1890s and received a telegram to rush back to Washington. Knowing that it was very urgent, he sent a telegram to Frederick Boothby in Portland, who was the general manager of the Maine Central Railroad, and simply said, "Please send train for large party." Reed, who was of the sort of mold of William Howard Taft, let's leave it at that, the train came. It had several passenger cars. The only person on the platform was the large party, Thomas B. Reed. But he got their attention. Moving on to Margaret J. Smith. first woman elected to serve in both the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate, sponsor of legislation to establish women in the military, first woman to be nominated for president at a national political convention, which occurred, her announcement occurred just this past week, 50 years ago. Author of the Declaration of Conscience speech of 1950, in which she courageously reminded her Senate colleagues and the nation, quote, some of the basic principles of Americanism, the right to criticize, the right to hold unpopular beliefs, the right to protest, and the right to independent thought. Finally, Edmund S. Muskie, member of the Maine House of Representatives, governor of Maine, U.S. Senator who sponsored major legislation for clean air, clean water, and historic preservation, chair of the Senate Budget Committee, Democratic candidate for vice president in 1968, U.S. Secretary of State under President Jimmy Carter, guided in his public life by what he called, quote, patient, persistent persuasion in order to achieve his goals. And from Senator Mitchell this morning, we heard a similar philosophy. So leaders such as these, William King, James G. Blaine, Thomas B. Reed, Margaret J. Smith, Edmund S. Muskie, and George J. Mitchell are Maine's gift to the nation. Thank you. And now it is my honor to call Senator Mitchell's son, Andrew, daughter Claire, and grandson Ian. If you will come up and help us unveil the portrait. Now it is my privilege to ask Senator Mitchell to come forward and give a few reflections. Thank you.
Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your presence and for your warm reception. Speaker Eves, President Alfon, Chief Justice Softley, Governor Brennan, many distinguished guests. I told Mark and Justin I've always wanted to wear one of those outfits. And if I'd known you guys were going to wear them today, I'd have rented one for me. But you look great in them, and I want you to know I'm very grateful to you personally for hosting this event. I'm also grateful to Bernard Fishman, the director of the Maine State Museum, and to Earl Shuttleworth for their generous comments. It shows the passage of time, but I met Earl when he was a student in high school. He was a historian even then, and he knows more about Maine and its history than any other certain living person, and probably anybody who's ever lived in Maine. And so, Earl, your words were very timely and well received. I want to especially thank three other people who've been central to this event. Sheila McDonald is the Deputy Director of the museum, and she has overseen this project with great care. Where is Sheila? Over here. Sheila, come on over. My old and dear friend Harold Pacious, who helped organize this event, and James Hanley, the artist who painted the portrait, in the course of which we've become good friends. He unfortunately could not be here today. I also want to personally thank those whose contributions made possible the work that was just unveiled. They are Harold and Claudia, Barbara Atkins, Tom and Linda Walsh, Paul and Yvette Mitchell, Bill and Vicki Mitchell, Harold and Mary Mitchell Friedman, Elliot and Melanie Cutler, Stuart and Linda Price, David Johnson and Cherise Kaplan, Donnie Peters, Robert Levine and the Elaine Gorbach Levine Charitable Foundation, and Adam Lee and the Lee Auto Malls. Thank each of you very much for your assistance. I also want to recognize and thank the members of my family and so many friends of mine who are here today, in particular my immediate family, my wife Heather, my daughters Andrea and Claire, my son Andrew, and my grandson Ian. The American Constitution prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, but it does not define the term. I think any reasonable definition must include not having to listen to 2 speeches by the same politician in one day. So those of you who just came down from the legislature where I gave a long speech are protected by the American Constitution. For those of you who didn't make it up to the legislature or hear the speech, well, I know most of you, and I'm well aware that you're relieved that you didn't have to hear that one. And I promise you, you don't have to hear another one. But if you're absolutely dying to know what I said, just let me know and I'll send you a signed copy and you can read it sometime. So I'm going to be very brief. I'm very fortunate to have received many awards and honors. By far the greatest honor of my life was the privilege of serving the people of Maine for 15 years in the United States Senate, and before that as United States Attorney for Maine and as a United States District Judge in Maine. To be recognized for that service is gratifying and humbling. But to be honored for doing what you love doing is a real pleasure. In particular, it's humbling for me to have my portrait take its place alongside those of the great men and women who Earl mentioned, who have been so important to our state. William King, James G. Blaine, Thomas Brackett Reed, Senator Margaret Chase Smith, and of course my mentor and hero, Senator Edmund Muskie. For me, this really is Dancing with the Stars. As Senate Majority Leader, I met, talked, or worked with every president from Lyndon Johnson to Barack Obama. And I met with leaders from all over the world, from Nelson Mandela to Mikhail Gorbachev, from the Queen of England to the King of Saudi Arabia, and just about every place in between. But believe it or not, to me, the very best part was getting the opportunity to travel to every town in Maine, to visit every high school in Maine. In fact, I also went to every bean supper held in Maine. And there I came to know very well the people of this great state, from Kittery to Fort Ken and from Eastport to Bethel. Not everyone agreed with me, of course, and I got my share of criticism, some of it justified. But wherever I went, I was met with courtesy and respect and warmth that made me feel a part not only of every community in Maine, but virtually every family. So it is to them, the ordinary citizens of the people of Maine, for whom I have the greatest respect, affection, and gratitude, that I dedicate this day. I thank them from the bottom of my heart for giving me the privilege of serving. And I thank all of you for helping me to do so. Thank you all very much, and have a great day.